Please stop, don't do this.
I watched her collapse under the weight of that cold torrent. My mother, her clothes soaked, her hands shaking, my little girl clinging to her side, eyes wide with fear. And then she spoke, her voice trembling. "You and your brat don't belong here. This house will never be yours." In that moment, the front door swung open. He walked in, silent, his eyes fixed on the horror unfolding before him. He stood frozen, torn between rage and disbelief, and the air around him snapped. If you were in his shoes right now, would you stand your ground or walk away? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 2 weeks before that shocking moment at the front door, David believed he was living a life that many could only dream of. He was a man who had built everything with his own 2 hands, a self-made millionaire who had known the sting of poverty as a child and vowed never to let his loved ones suffer again. But despite his wealth, David lived modestly and quietly, because he cared more about character than appearances. He had long hidden the full extent of his fortune, testing the true hearts of those who came close to him. Angela, his fiancée, was the woman who had captured his attention in public, elegant, composed, and admired by everyone who saw her. She carried herself with a confidence that drew others in, but behind closed doors, her charm shifted. With David, she was affectionate, but toward his mother and his young niece, there was a different side, one that whispered contempt, one that hinted at something cold. His mother, a quiet widow, had given her entire life to raising her children with dignity, and when tragedy struck and her daughter passed away, she took in her granddaughter without hesitation. David admired her strength, her patience, her ability to hold the family together with little more than faith and resilience. To protect them, he had kept his mother and niece living in the family's old home, not because he couldn't provide more, but because he wanted to preserve their sense of normalcy and independence. Yet in that same home, Angela began to reveal her disdain. She was polite when David was present, but when his back was turned, small cracks appeared. At dinner, she would make accidental comments that sounded like jokes to others, but landed as insults, mocking the simple meals his mother cooked, sighing dramatically at the niece's innocent laughter. Once, while reaching for a glass, she spilled water across the table, letting it drench his mother's lap, then laughed, blaming clumsiness. His mother said nothing, only lowered her eyes and forced a smile. The little girl clutched her grandmother's hand tighter that night, sensing something unkind she could not name. David noticed only fragments, never the full picture. To him, Angela was still the poised woman everyone respected, but beneath that mask, something was steadily taking root, and in quiet corners of the house words were exchanged that he would not have believed if told directly. Angela would lean down to the child and whisper, "You know, this house isn't really yours. Soon everything will change." The child, too young to understand fully, only knew that those words made her uneasy. And for his mother, every day became a test of patience, every encounter a reminder that not everyone who smiles at the dinner table is truly a friend. Angela's subtle jabs soon turned into sharper blows, her polished smile disguising the bitterness in her voice whenever David wasn't around. She began her campaign quietly, planting seeds of disdain in conversations with David. Over breakfast one morning, she leaned across the table and said almost casually, "David, don't you think your mother would be better cared for in a home? She's aging, she looks so fragile. I mean, wouldn't that be kinder than burdening her with responsibility she can't handle?" Her words were framed as concern, but the venom wasn't hidden from those who knew better. David's mother, sitting just a few feet away, heard every syllable, and though her face remained calm, her heart sank. Angela's eyes flicked toward the little girl at that moment, and with a tilt of her head she added, "And let's be honest, raising a child at her age, it's not fair to anyone. Your niece is, well, she's baggage. Sooner or later she'll hold us back." David dismissed it at first, telling Angela that his family was not a burden, but Angela's expression hardened into silence, a silence that promised this was not the end of her campaign. The following days became darker for the small household. At dinner one evening, Angela set a steaming bowl of stew before David's mother. She smiled sweetly, urging her to eat. But within moments of taking her first spoonful, his mother gagged, choking, tears streaming from her eyes as her throat burned. The meat was spoiled, unmistakably sour. Angela leaned back in her chair, chuckled, and waved her hand as though it were a minor mishap. "Oh, I didn't realize," she said with mock innocence, her laughter cutting through the silence of the room. David's mother tried to regain her composure, dabbing her lips with a napkin, forcing a smile that masked her humiliation. The little girl stared, frightened, not by the food but by the way Angela's laughter lingered long after the bowl was pushed away. Angela's cruelty didn't stop there. She began cornering the child when David was away, bending low so her voice could sting like a knife. "Your uncle won't always be here," she whispered. "Nobody wants you. You're just extra weight." The child's wide eyes filled with tears, but she dared not tell her uncle. She had already seen how Angela's words hurt her grandmother, and she thought silence might protect them both. Instead, she clung closer to her grandmother, the only source of comfort she knew. David's business trip came at the worst possible time. He had to leave for several days, trusting Angela to care for his home in his absence. It was then that her mask slipped completely. With David gone, Angela assumed control of the household, her tone sharp and commanding. She ordered his mother and niece to scrub floors, polish furniture, and clean every corner, as if they were servants rather than family. "This house won't clean itself," she barked. When the older woman struggled to lift a bucket, Angela sneered. "Pathetic. No wonder you should be in a nursing home." The little girl's hands grew raw from scrubbing, but when she paused, Angela slapped the mop back into her hands, mocking her tears. The cruelties escalated until one afternoon, Angela decided to turn her disdain into spectacle. She stood in the kitchen, holding a bucket filled with foul mop water, the stench rising. David's mother had just bent down to pick up a fallen plate, the little girl clutching her side, when Angela's voice sliced the air. "Not good enough. You'll never clean properly, no matter how hard you try." And with that, she lifted the bucket and poured its contents over them. The filthy water soaked through the older woman's clothing, splattered across the child's face, and pooled on the floor. The little girl whimpered, trembling, while her grandmother whispered, "Please stop. Don't do this." Angela only laughed, a cruel, ringing laugh that echoed through the house. She stood towering over them, satisfied with their humiliation, believing no one would ever know what she had done. Angela's laughter filled the room, sharp and hollow, bouncing against the walls like a cruel echo. She looked down at David's mother, who was still on her knees, clothes clinging to her skin from the dirty water. The little girl clutched her grandmother's arm, her eyes red from tears and her small body trembling with shame. Angela folded her arms, chin tilted in mock superiority, and said with a sneer, "You two are nothing but leeches. You've lived off David for far too long. This house, this life, it isn't yours, it never will be." She laughed again, her words stabbing at the heart of the woman who had raised David, the woman who had done nothing but show kindness, even when treated with cruelty. For Angela, this was triumph, the culmination of her silent war to erase the presence of David's family. But what she didn't realize was that her performance was no longer private. As she laughed, a shadow fell across the doorway. The sound of a suitcase being set down broke through the moment. The little girl looked up, her tears catching the light, and her lips parted in disbelief. There he was, David. He had returned earlier than expected, his figure framed by the open door, his expression unreadable. For a moment the room seemed to freeze. Angela's laughter faltered, the sound dying in her throat as her eyes locked on him. The bucket slipped from her hand and clattered against the tile, the last drops of filthy water dripping onto the floor. Silence wrapped around them like a shroud. David didn't speak right away. His gaze moved from his mother, kneeling on the floor, to his niece, still clutching her tightly, and finally to Angela. His jaw tightened, and the weight of his stare pressed down heavier than any words could. Angela's face twitched, her practiced smile snapping back into place as she stammered, "Honey, it's just a joke. You came home early. You caught me. Playing around with them. She forced a laugh, high-pitched and desperate, but the sound fell flat in the suffocating quiet. David took a step forward, his shoes clicking against the wet floor. His presence filled the room, but he still said nothing. The little girl's grip on her grandmother loosened just slightly, as if sensing that safety had walked in at last. Angela's eyes darted from David to the puddle of dirty water, to the humiliated figures on the floor, and back to David again. Her confidence was slipping, her words tumbling out faster. You know how your mother is, always making a fuss over nothing. And the child, she exaggerates everything. I was only trying to teach them some discipline. Her excuses cracked with each word, unable to mask the truth that hung in the air. David's silence became unbearable. He bent down slowly, extending his hand to help his mother stand. His mother's frail fingers clutched his, and with his other arm he lifted the little girl to her feet. He wrapped them both in his arms for a brief moment, shielding them with his body. When he finally looked back at Angela, the warmth in his eyes was gone. All that remained was a storm she could not control. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that precedes a reckoning. Angela tried again, her voice trembling now. You don't believe them over me, do you? I mean, you know me. You know I love you. But David didn't answer. The silence itself was his judgment, and it terrified her more than anger ever could. David did not shout. He did not slam his fists or throw accusations wildly, though every fiber of his being burned with anger. Instead, he guided his mother and niece gently to the couch, his voice steady as he told them to sit and rest. His calmness was more terrifying than rage, because it showed he was in complete control. Angela watched in silence, her smile flickering and fading as he reached into his suitcase. From it, David withdrew a small black folder and a slim hard drive. He placed them on the table deliberately, each movement precise, each pause louder than words. Finally, he looked at her, and his voice, low and steady, broke the silence. I trusted you, but trust, Angela, is proven when no one is watching. Angela's eyes darted to the objects on the table, and her heart thudded. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice breaking as she took a step toward him. David leaned back slightly, creating a space she could not close. For months I've had cameras installed in this house, he said. Not for you, for their safety. He gestured to his mother and niece. I've seen enough to know the truth. Angela's face drained of color. She reached for his arm in desperation, but he stepped back, refusing her touch. David, she whispered, her tone changing from defensive to pleading. You don't understand. It's not what it looks like. I was under stress. I didn't mean... But her words faltered when David slid a USB drive into the television system and pressed play. The screen lit up. There, in vivid clarity, Angela's cruelty played before their eyes. Footage of her whispering venom into the little girl's ear. Images of her laughing as David's mother gagged on spoiled food. Clips of her ordering them to scrub and clean while she watched with a smirk. And finally, the bucket of filthy water pouring down on them as she sneered, calling them leeches. Each moment froze the air in the room. Angela clasped her hands over her mouth, trembling, whispering, Turn it off, David. Please, please. But he did not. He let it play, let the silence of the room deepen with every second of her exposed cruelty. The following evening, a dinner party had been arranged, an event Angela believed was to celebrate the upcoming wedding, a gathering of family and friends to announce a new chapter in their lives. She arrived, dressed immaculately, her confidence restored, certain that David would not betray her in front of others. But when the guests settled and the lights dimmed, David stood at the front of the room holding the remote. Angela smiled tightly, ready to bask in the glow of admiration. Instead, the footage began to roll again, this time on a large screen for everyone to see. Gasps filled the hall. Some guests turned their eyes away, others covered their mouths in shock. Whispered judgments cut through the air as Angela stood frozen, her cheeks burning. How could she? Someone muttered. Another shook their head, saying, I thought she was different. Each clip played, each humiliation magnified. By the time the footage ended, the room had turned cold. The admiration she once craved now curdling into disgust. Angela tried to speak, tried to laugh it off once more. "It was just jokes, just silly misunderstandings," she stammered. But no one laughed with her. Friends excused themselves quietly, leaving without goodbyes. Her reputation was unraveling before her eyes. David stood firmly, his voice even as he delivered the final blow. "Angela, this engagement is over. I will not marry someone who dishonors my family." She gasped, clutching at his sleeve, begging, "David, don't do this to me. Not here, not like this." But he shook her hand off and continued, "You signed a prenuptial agreement. You walk away with nothing. The credit cards are cancelled. The cars, the house, everything you thought was yours. It never was. Tonight, you lose not just me, but the life you tried to claim at their expense." Angela collapsed into her chair, sobbing, mascara streaking down her face. Her once proud posture shrank as whispers continued around her. She had been exposed, stripped of the elegance she flaunted, left with only humiliation, public, undeniable, final. And as she cried, David turned his back on her, walking toward his mother and niece, embracing them both. In that moment, the justice was not just financial or social, it was moral. Angela had tried to break them, but instead, she was the one shattered, her cruelty laid bare for the world to see. When the final guest had left the dinner party, leaving Angela behind in tears and disgrace, David quietly turned his attention back to the two people who mattered most: his mother, who had endured silent humiliation, and his young niece, who had carried fear on her small shoulders for far too long. He placed his hands on theirs and whispered a promise that from this day forward they would never be subjected to cruelty again. And unlike Angela's hollow words, David's promises had weight. That very night he arranged for them to move into his mansion, a home that had stood empty too long, waiting for a family who truly belonged there. It was not the gleaming marble or the sprawling gardens that mattered, but the sense of safety that filled the halls when they entered together. For his mother, the dignity she had quietly clung to was restored. For the little girl, the mansion became more than walls. It became a refuge where laughter could return. The first morning they awoke there, sunlight streamed through tall windows. The little girl ran across polished floors, her small feet echoing as she explored rooms she had never dared imagine living in. For the first time in weeks, her lips curved into a smile unburdened by fear. She climbed into David's lap and pressed her face against his chest. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "Uncle, we're safe now." David held her close, and in that embrace was the quiet victory his heart needed most. Not wealth, not power, but the reassurance that his family was finally free of cruelty. His mother, watching from across the room, allowed herself to exhale deeply. The lines of worry that had marked her face softened, replaced by something gentler: relief. Angela did not surrender her pride easily. In the days that followed, she appeared at David's gates, dressed in her finest clothes, pleading for forgiveness. Her words tumbled quickly, excuses, apologies, declarations of love, but the memory of her laughter as she poured that bucket of filth could not be erased. David refused to meet her alone, and instead security escorted her away. Her once commanding presence had dissolved into desperation, her reputation in shambles, her future uncertain. She had sought to rise by stepping on others, but the ground had given way beneath her. David, meanwhile, turned his attention wholly to those who had always mattered. He ensured his mother no longer had to labor in silence, hiring help to ease her days while surrounding her with comfort and respect. For his niece, he filled her world with stability and joy, investing in her education, her passions, and her future. The house that had once echoed with Angela's mocking words now rang with the sound of shared meals, gentle conversations, and the laughter of a child who felt truly at home. In the end, David's choice was not only about exposing cruelty, but about affirming what mattered most: that dignity, once tested, can emerge stronger than before. Angela's arrogance had indeed built her a castle in the air, a facade she flaunted before others, but cruelty is always self-destructive. And as the walls of her illusions crumbled, the quiet resilience of David's mother and the innocent trust of his niece stood tall. Justice was not simply delivered in public humiliation, but in the restoration of their peace, their safety, their honor. And so, the story closes with a reflection. Arrogance can build castles in the air, but cruelty always tears them down. In the end, dignity doesn't just survive, it triumphs.